Welcome to History Date Night, a World War II podcast covering the Second World War in chronological order, from the opening shots to final victory. I'm Justin, and joining me is my wife and co-host, Jenny. Together we explore the people, battles, and turning points that shape the deadliest conflict in human history, one date at a time. On this episode,
the wrong island in the wrong sea in the wrong country.
From the largest killing center of the Holocaust.
Will define the next several decades.
Welcome back to History Date Night. I'm Justin. Last episode we dealt with the aftermath of the Winter War, which included the evacuation of Karelia, the collapse of the Allied plan to use Finland as a pretext for occupying Norway, and the first British civilian killed by a German bomb. This episode covers March 19th through the 29th. France gets a new prime minister. Two physicists in Birmingham write a memo that starts the British atomic bomb program. Himmler orders a new concentration camp built near a Polish town. And the Soviet Union publicly declares its neutrality in the European War, after it just spent 105 days demonstrating that it was not overly good at fighting wars.
I'm Jenny. This week also birthed the concept of a country that will eventually become Pakistan. A French destroyer is sunk by its own torpedo, Woody Guthrie's first ever recording, an Indian nationalist's assassination trial beginning, and Reynaud's proposal to bomb Soviet oil fields, which the British set aside for now. Let's get into it.
March 19th, 3 days after the Scapa Flow raid that killed James Isbister and 6 sailors, Britain retaliates. 50 RAF bombers, the largest concentration of British aircraft sent against a single German target to date, attacked the German seaplane base at Hornum, on the southern tip of the North Sea island of Sylt. Chamberlain announces the raid publicly in the House of Commons while it is still happening, a deliberate piece of political theater meant to answer Churchill's complaint from the previous week that Britain only drops leaflets while Germany drops bombs.
The raid is loud and well publicized. Its actual effectiveness is another matter. Most crews report attacking the target as briefed, and one aircraft is lost to flak. But subsequent reconnaissance shows that remarkably little physical damage was actually done to the base. One pilot, by at least one account, manages to bomb entirely the wrong island in the wrong sea in the wrong country, dropping his payload on the Danish island of Bornholm in the Baltic instead of Sylt in the North Sea. Dropping his payload on the Danish island of Bornholm in the Baltic instead of Sylt in the North Sea. He does no damage there either. It is Britain's biggest show of aerial force so far in the war, and it accomplishes almost nothing except proving that Britain can drop things other than paper.
March 20th in Paris. Prime Minister Edouard Daladier goes before the Chamber of Deputies for a vote of confidence, worn down by weeks of criticism over France's failure to meaningfully help Finland. He wins the vote 239-1, but 294 of the 551 deputies abstain rather than vote either way. And the abstentions are not really about Finland. Daladier had insisted on retaining the portfolios of both national defense and foreign affairs in addition to being the prime minister. He concentrated an enormous amount of power in his own hands, and a large block of deputies are furious about it, without necessarily wanting him gone entirely. Daladier reads the abstentions as a vote of no confidence regardless of the technical math, and resigns.
He is replaced on March 21st by Paul Reynaud, a small man, physically slight, with hunched shoulders, a deep-lined face, and what contemporaries described as a nasal, tinny voice. Despite the unglamorous physical description, he is considered one of the most respected speakers in the chamber, a former Paris lawyer and financial expert who served as finance minister right up until the night before he became prime minister. Reynaud has a track record that looks on paper exactly right for what comes next. He has become one of the most consistent backers of the officers. Men like Colonel Charles de Gaulle, who have spent years arguing that France relies too heavily on the static defense of the Maginot Line and needs to embrace mobile, offensive armored warfare instead. Daladier, remarkably, remains in the new government as Minister of Defense, despite having just been forced out as Prime Minister by many of the same men now serving under Reynaud. Two refugee physicists, Otto Frisch and Rudolf Perls, both Jewish scientists who fled Nazi Germany and Austria, present a paper to Sir Henry Tizard, the British government's chief scientific advisor. Its argument is stark and precise. It would be possible to build a devastating bomb through nuclear chain reaction, and critically, it would require only a few pounds of a particular uranium isotope, not the tons that had previously been assumed necessary.
This is the Frisch Peerless Memorandum. Forgive me for that pronunciation. And this is one of the truly pivotal documents of the entire war. Before it, the scientific consensus, including among many of the physicists themselves, was that an atomic weapon, if theoretically possible at all, would require an amount of fissile material so large as to be impractical to produce or deliver. Frisch and Peierls, I had to consult pronunciation on that one, do the math properly and conclude that a critical mass, small enough to fit within a suitcase-sized bomb, could produce an explosion of catastrophic power, and that such a bomb could likely be built within the time frame of the current war. They also warn with grim precision about the radioactive fallout such a weapon would produce. The British government takes the matter seriously. This memo leads directly to the formation of the Maud Committee, which will spend the rest of 1940 and into 1941 investigating whether the bomb is truly feasible. This work eventually feeds into the American Manhattan Project, the program that we've mentioned in early episodes.
The same week, other pieces of the puzzle move forward on both sides of the eventual conflict. The British government places an order for heavy water from Norway, a substance essential for certain approaches to nuclear reactor design and, by extension, plutonium production. And in Germany, at a research facility on the Baltic coast called Peenemünde, static firing tests begin on the basic engine intended for what will become the A4 rocket, better known to history by its later design, the V2. Two entirely separate weapons programs, one nuclear and one built around rocketry, both take concrete developmental steps in the same week in March 1940. Neither will be ready in time to change this war's outcome, but both will define the next several decades of human history.
Late March in Berlin, Heinrich Himmler orders the construction of a concentration camp near the Polish town of Oświęcim, a town of moderate size in the general government territory of occupied Poland, roughly 40 miles west of Krakow. The site had previously been chosen in part because of its existing military barracks and its position at a major rail junction. The German name for Oświęcim is Auschwitz. We spoke about the site selection back in episode 19. This week, the order to actually build the camp is given. Construction will begin within weeks, and by 1942 it will become the largest killing center of the Holocaust.
On March 20th, in Moscow, Lavrentiy Beria dispatches 11 NKVD killing squads into Ukraine and Belarus with orders to arrest, execute, and deport resistance elements in the newly Soviet-controlled territories. This is a direct continuation of the machinery we described back in episode 25, when Stalin and the Politburo signed the order authorizing the Katyn massacre on March 5th. The killings at Katyn Forest itself began the following month, in April. What's happening this week is the broader apparatus being activated across the entire occupied zone. Not just the captured Polish officers, but a systematic sweep against anyone identified as a potential source of resistance to Soviet rule.
And on March 22nd, something smaller in scale but symbolically significant begins in Hanko, the Finnish peninsula leased to the Soviet Union for 30 years under the terms of the Moscow Peace Treaty. Soviet military personnel began arriving to take possession of what is now, functionally, a Soviet naval base on Finnish soil, roughly 80 miles from Helsinki. For the Finns watching this happen, it is a daily, visible reminder of what the war cost. Soviet ships and Soviet uniforms occupying a piece of Finnish coastline, a permanent fixture of the new diminished map of their country.
March 23rd, Lahore, in what is then British India, the All India Muslim League, meeting at its annual session, adopts what becomes known as the Lahore Resolution. The resolution calls for the creation of independent states for Muslims in the northwestern and eastern regions of British India, where Muslims form a majority of the population. It doesn't use the word Pakistan, and the specifics of what's being demanded remains deliberately vague at this stage. Some historians argue that it envisioned multiple autonomous Muslim states rather than just one unified nation. But this is the founding document. The moment the demand for a separate Muslim homeland moves from informal discussion into official party policy. 7 years later, in August 1947, that demand becomes the independent nation of Pakistan, carved out of British India in a partition that will displace an estimated 15 million people and kill hundreds of thousands more. The resolution adopted this week in Lahore is where the entire story just begins.
Also this week, on March 23rd, 12 IRA prisoners riot at Dartmoor Prison in England, taking 2 wardens hostage and locking a third in a cell, and then setting a fire that burns for 90 minutes before it's brought under control. Ireland's uneasy relationship with the British war effort continues to play out in prison yards as much as in diplomatic channels. On March 24th, an unfortunate incident takes place. Off of the city of Casablanca, in what is now Morocco, the French destroyer La Réus is destroyed by the accidental detonation of one of her own torpedoes, killing 28 crewmen and wounding 24 more.
On March 25th, the British government issues an order forbidding British servicemen from participating in German propaganda radio broadcasts if they are captured as prisoners of war. The order exists because of an unusual practice that had developed organically among British families. People had been tuning into German radio broadcasts, specifically hoping to hear the voices of their captured relatives that were used in German propaganda broadcasts. On March 26th, Canada holds a federal election. William Lyon Mackenzie King's Liberal Party wins the largest majority in Canadian history to that point. The same day, New Zealand's Labour Prime Minister, Michael Savage, dies to cancer at 68. He is succeeded by Peter Fraser.
And a few grace notes. On March 21st, folk musician Woody Guthrie is recorded for the very first time, interviewed and performing original and traditional songs for Alan Lomax and the Library of Congress. On March 23rd, the radio quiz show Truth or Consequences premieres, eventually becoming one of the most popular formats in American broadcasting history. On March 27th, Alfred Hitchcock's movie Rebecca premieres in Los Angeles. The U.S.'s entertainment media has continued on its merry way with no disruptions, despite of the war. Back to France. The new Prime Minister, Reynaud, does not waste time asserting a more aggressive posture than his predecessor. On March 26th, he enthusiastically embraces and accelerates existing Anglo-French planning to bomb Soviet oil fields at Baku, in what is now Azerbaijan, on the Caspian Sea, and to attack Soviet shipping in the Black Sea, aimed at cutting off the flow of oil the Soviet Union has been supplying to Germany under their trade agreement. The British Chiefs of Staff and Chamberlain are unwilling to proceed immediately. Britain has no appetite for opening a new front against Stalin while already fighting Hitler, though reconnaissance on the Baku fields does continue quietly for now.
Meanwhile, the plan to intervene in Norway, abandoned on March 14th, the moment that the Winter War ended, and its pretext disappeared. It's quietly revived by the end of this week. On March 28th, at a meeting of the Supreme War Council in London, attended by Reynaud and General Gamelin, Britain and France agree on a plan to mine Norwegian territorial waters, codenamed, once again, Operation Wilfred. Time to begin on April 5th. A parallel plan, Operation Royal Marine, will mine the Rhine River, pending French cabinet approval. On March 29th, a British General Staff also prepares Plan R4, a contingency to actually land troops at Narvik, Trondheim, Stavanger, and Bergen in Norway if Germany reacts to the mining operation by moving into Norway itself. Wilfred's start date will later slip from April 5th to April 8th. That delay, as we'll see in coming episodes, turns out to be extremely consequential because Germany's own invasion of Norway, Weserübung, is already scheduled, and the two operations are converging in the same week without either side fully appreciating how close the timing really actually is.
We will close this episode by returning to the Soviet Union's internal reckoning with its performance in the Winter War with Finland. Chief Marshal of Artillery N.N. Voronov, the same officer who warned before the invasion that it would take 2 or 3 months, not the 12 days his superiors demanded that he plan around, writes about a plenary session of the Communist Party's Central Committee held in late March 1940, specifically to examine the war's lessons. The session identifies serious shortcomings in Soviet operations, in troop training, and in the Army's failure to properly use its own modern equipment. Troops, the assessment concludes, were catastrophically unprepared for forced warfare and extreme cold. The authority of political commissars embedded in the units is sharply reduced as commanders regain greater operational control. Traditional military ranks like general begin to be restored that spring.
Finnish Field Marshal Mannerheim, reflecting afterward on the Red Army that he just spent 105 days fighting, offers his own private assessment. He believed that using political officers in combat ranks was a fundamental mistake. Orders requiring political approval caused delays that could prove disastrous, and worse, they stripped away initiative. He also observed that surrounded, starving, freezing Soviet unions did not surrender, partly because of the fear of reprisals against soldiers' families back at home, and that this pressure occasionally drove men to suicide rather than capture. His overall verdict on the Soviet High Command's original planning is blunt. It was a fundamental error to begin the invasion without properly accounting for the physical character of the actual battlefield or the nature of the people defending it. The Soviets had the opportunity to study and prepare for fighting in Finnish conditions, and they just chose not to, relying instead on technology and attempting to simply just repeat the tactics that worked against Poland. Tactics that predictably did not work in dense forest with 2-meter snowdrifts between the trees.
And on March 29th, the very last day our episode covers, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov delivers a lengthy speech to the Supreme Soviet, which is the USSR's version of a parliament, reviewing the entire foreign situation and the Winter War specifically. He accuses Britain and France of having planned to use Finland as a staging ground for an attack on the Soviet Union. This claim inverts the actual history of who invaded whom, but it does serve Soviet propaganda's need to frame the war as defensive. He describes the pacts imposed on the Baltic states as being, quote, carried out in a satisfactory manner, end quote, creating what he calls, quote, premises for a further improvement in relations between the Soviet Union, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, end quote. Relations that will, within little more than a year, culminate in those countries being formally absorbed into the USSR entirely. And Molotov declares flatly that the Soviet Union will remain neutral in the broader European war between Germany and the Allies, having just fought and only barely won a brutal 3.5-month conflict of its own. The Soviet Union announces it intends to sit the rest of this war out. Nobody listening in March 1940 has any way of knowing that this declared neutrality will only last about 15 months.
So, Britain retaliates for Scapa Flow with its biggest bombing raid yet, and just mostly misses. Daladier falls, and the more combative Reynaud takes his place. 2 refugee physicists calculate that a bomb built from a few pounds of uranium is not just possible, but actually achievable within this war's time frame. Himmler orders Auschwitz built. Beria's killing squads move into Ukraine and Belarus. Soviet troops arrive to occupy the Finnish naval base Finland was forced to give away. The Muslim League adopts the resolution that leads to Pakistan. Reynaud proposes attacking Soviet oil fields, and the idea is set aside for now. Operation Wilfred is quietly revived with an April date that will conflict with the German plan named Weserübung. And the Soviet Union, having just demonstrated its own army's serious weaknesses to the entire watching world, declares itself neutral in the war next door. Europe edges another step closer to the catastrophic months of April and May 1940. Well, thanks for joining us for episode 28 of History Date Night. We'll see you next time.
See you then.